back door. And so they decided to take matters into their own and say, let's go and colonize them to stop that slave trading. It is also important to note that the idea of slave trade was different from our own idea of slave trade. For instance, they slave traded mostly, especially on the national level, to cultivate farms and all of that. Of course, there were a lot of other atrocities, even killings of the black people, and they also saw the black race as inferior. But when we wanted to do our own slave trade, it was a little bit hyper, a little bit more barbaric as it were. And so it was like a great concern to the Western world. And they came to the conclusion, let us just go and colonize them so that we can stop this idea of slave trade. Are we still together now? So the British Empire banned slave trade in 1807. They abolished all slavery in 1833. But within the Nigerian environment, slave trade was still a major business, even amongst towns and communities within Nigeria. It wasn't just transatlantic, that is, it wasn't slave trade across the oceans or between white men and black men. Even amongst the black people, a lot of slave trade was going on. There was also the issue of course, commerce and legitimate trade. That's another reason why Britain colonized Nigeria. They saw that Nigeria had good commercial potential, especially by the time we entered into the 18th century. They discovered Nigeria was rich in palm oil, which was a big, luxurious agricultural produce at that time. Palm oil and palm kernel and all those stuff. And they began to take interest in our nation, particularly to colonize what we have, our substances. Again, I told you last week, they looked at Africa as a very fertile agricultural ground, and so they took interest in many of the things that we were producing as crops. In fact, one of the reasons they took our slaves was to go and plant those things or cultivate those farms in those other countries. So, many historians believe that this is the major reason why Britain colonized Nigeria, because of our palm oil market, palm kernel market, and all the products that were very useful to them and to their economy that we had at that time. Another reason is that they wanted to assess the interior of Africa. Now, if you see the map, I don't know if the PRU can help you with that. If you see the map of Africa, you know, of course, that Nigeria has borders across the water areas. And so the other areas that could not be assessed because there were no waters needed a starting point to explore. So they said, if we can colonize Nigeria, for instance, we want to access Niger Republic, we want to access Chad and Sudan and all those other interior parts of the Sudan that do not have linkages to water bodies, and so we cannot use water transportation to access them, because in those days, of course, there was no flight and there were means of transportation. So their logic was, you get Nigeria, you can access. Remember, they were in all these countries. Africa, you see, at that time, the European countries were just dividing Africa for themselves. You have French take on